Today we will be learning about the transatlantic slave trade and the African diaspora. So first we will start by making a KWL chart. The K stands for what you already know about the slave trade. The W stands for what you want to know about the slave trade. The L stands for what you seek to learn about the slave trade. We will fill out the L subsequent to our lesson. So, what we will do is we will break up into 4 groups of 5 students, and together we will read the transatlantic slave trade. We will focus on the sections capture and enslavement, the development of the slave trade, and the suppression of the slave trade. Now I will give you some important dates as an example of what you will be doing in the next activity. So in 1502 was the first ever reported of African slaves in the New World. Between 1640 and 1680, it was the beginning of the large-scale introduction of African slave labor in the British Caribbean for the production of sugar. In 1791, the Haitian Revolution began with the slave uprising in the French West Indian colony of Santo Domingo. The revolution eventually led to the establishment of the Black nation of Haiti 10 years later. Haiti was also the first nation to gain their independence from colonization. In 1793, waves of white refugees poured into the United States, fleeing the insurrection of Santo Domingo. So they feared the power that the Black people in Haiti had gotten for themselves. So they fled and came to the United States. In 1794, France emancipated all slaves in the French colonies. In the United States, the Congress passed legislation prohibiting the manufacture, fitting, equipping, loading, or dispatching of any vessel to be employed in the slave trade. Now, we will watch an interactive video which will give you a better understanding of how many slaves were transported, where they were transported from, where they ended up, how many people were on the slaves, etc., etc. Now we will watch this interactive video that gives you a better understanding of how many slaves were transported, where they were transported from, and where they ended up. From the beginning of the slave trade in the 16th century to its conclusion in the 19th century, merchants brought the vast majority of slaves to the Caribbean and to Brazil. Of more than the 10 million enslaved Africans to eventually reach the Western Hemisphere, almost 400,000 of them, which is less than 4%, came to North America. About 1.3 million went to Central America, 4 million were brought to British, French, Dutch, and the Danish, and the remainder of the 4.8 million people were brought to Brazil and the Caribbean. The dots that you see represent individual slave ships. The size of the dot correlates with the size of the ship. The larger the dot, the more enslaved people were on the ship. So if I pause this map and I click on a dot, it will show us the name of the ship, where it was going, and here it says the Cupidon, going to France, was a 100-ton ship that left West Central Africa or St. Helena with 420 enslaved people on board. It arrived in Martinique with 360 people, meaning that over 80 people, or that about 80 people, either died or were thrown off board. It made 2 journeys between 1711 and 1722 and transported a total of 480 Africans. If we click on another dot, we see that this one was heading to Great Britain. This ship left the Gold Coast with 376 enslaved people and arrived in Kingston, Jamaica with 325. It made 6 journeys between 1708 and 1718 and transported a total of 1,636 Africans. If we continue to play the map, you see that there were much more people that were transported, and we haven't even reached the height of the slave trade. The interactive animation shows us more than 20,000 voyages cataloged in the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. So as you can see, in the 1700s, the Spaniards slowed their transport of slaves, while the British, the French, the Dutch, and eventually the Americans increased their importation of slaves. This remained the same for about 100 years, between 1725 and 1825. This was also the zenith of the slave trade, as Europeans sent more than 7.2 million into forced labor, diseases they were not accustomed to, which led to mass death from smallpox, the bubonic plague, and other diseases they were not accustomed to coming from Africa. And we watch as massive people get sent to Brazil. They're barely coming to the United States. They're slowing down, but the Caribbean and Brazil increased their intake of slaves at this time, especially. Now that you have watched that video and you have seen more information on the slave trade, we will now use big sheets of construction paper and use different colored markers. In your groups, we will collaborate to create a timeline of the African slave trade and also draw a map showing the vast transportation of slaves. You can color code them or label them to make it easier when you present to the class. You will then get up in groups and present your maps and share any thoughts or ideas about the slave trade that you have with your peers. You can say how it made you feel, you can talk about why you thought the slave trade was important, anything you feel you want to share with the class after explaining the transport where the slaves came from, you're more than welcome to do that. After that, I want students to work individually to write a 1 to 2 paragraph reflection on how you felt about the slave trade. What was it like to work in a group? How much did you participate in the group? Do you feel like the group heard your ideas, and did the group actually implement any of your ideas? Did you feel comfortable doing group work, or did you feel more comfortable doing individual work? Do you have any suggestions for me on how the lesson went, or how you think I could teach the lesson better? Your maps will be hung around the class and will be used for a follow-up lesson, where we will watch the Lifetime Routes series so you can get a visual of how slaves were transported, how they were treated on slave ships, and how they tried to revolt, and eventually what life was like on a plantation. Many slaves jumped overboard prior to getting to their locations because the thought of being enslaved after coming from a certain kind of lifestyle was unfeasible to them. So in watching the Lifetime Roots series, which is in 4 parts, but we will only be watching part 1 because part 1 highlights the transport of the slaves. Students will get a better visual of what it was like to be transported on a slave ship, the mental effects that it had, and the emotional effects it had on slaves. I will now show a preview of Roots Part 1 because that is the section of the Lifetime series that highlights on the transport, and for homework, students are to go home and share with their parents and their families what they learned about the slave trade. They are to ask their parents about their lineages and write a 1-page journal entry about what they were told about their family and how it makes them feel. Subsequent to that, I will have students do a family tree, and we will hold a cultural day where students will come in dressed up in their cultural attire and bring in food from their various countries and explain their various cultures to their peers as a means of teaching students about their own histories and giving them a sense of pride in who they are at their roots, but also to show them how wide the African diaspora is. Because today, many people from the Caribbean, many people in Brazil, many people in the United States do not know of their roots because there were no definitive documentations of who they were, where they come from, birth certificates, death certificates. So for students to learn about their roots and how their roots are tied back to Africa, it gives them a sense of pride in who they are, and it helps them connect with their roots, it helps them connect with their history, and it helps them connect with other students.
You must hear your name first. You are Kunta Kinte, son of Omoran Binta Kinte. You must always honor your ancestors, the ones who love you and watch over you.
It's time your family pay Kunta.
Run!
Move!
Jump! Jump!
I own this property, boy, and everything on it.
There is no South without slavery.
But God is my witness. I say you, even if he part you tomorrow, your love, it will never die.
A name is who you is. My daddy took whippings night and day to protect his name.
Speak to me, Lord! Speak to me, Lord!
Think I don't know he my daddy?
If you ever touch just one, I'll kill you.
You brought this upon yourself and upon your poor family.
No! You brought it on my family! I don't take my family!
But there's a brand new show for you to watch today. So while the Western eyes turn the beats of the way, where your carelessness stands, where spirits you ways, we are what we made.
We got the same blood, boy. He was a slave, too. You just never knew it.
Your name is your spirit. Your name is your shield.